The roar was a living thing, a wave of sound that crashed over Elvis Presley every time he stepped onto the stage. Tonight in a packed auditorium somewhere in America, it was no different. The spotlights were hot, blinding white discs that followed his every move. He wore a shimmering gold-laned jacket, a custom-made creation that felt both like a second skin and a gilded cage. Every sequin, every stitch screamed king. He moved with an effortless grace, his hips swaying, his lips curling into that familiar mischievous smile. He sang jailhouse rock, his voice powerful and raw, cutting through the frenzied screams of his fans. They adored him. They screamed his name, threw flowers, reached out as if to touch a deity, and in that moment he was Elvis the phenomenon, the sensation, a man who had changed music forever. But beneath the gold jacket, behind the dazzling smile, a quiet weariness settled in his bones. He loved his fans, truly he did. Their energy fueled him, lifted him. But the sheer relentless intensity of it night after night, city after city, was draining. Every public appearance was a performance, every conversation an interview, every moment a spectacle. He was always on. As the final notes of the song faded, the applause swelled to a deafening crescendo. He bowed, blowing kisses, soaking in the adulation. It was exhilarating, addictive even. But then, as he walked off stage, the roar began to recede, and the silence in his dressing room felt like a physical weight. The sweat dripped down his back, cooling quickly in the air conditioning. His throat was a little raw. He looked at himself in the mirror, the famous face, the perfectly coiffed hair, the exhausted eyes. "Another one down," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. His manager, Colonel Parker, was already talking business in the next room, the low murmur of his voice. A constant backdrop to Elvis's life bodyguards stood sentinel outside the door. There was no escaping. The drive back to Graceland was a blur of dark highways, and the muted hum of the engine. Elvis stared out the window, watching streetlights streak past. The world outside was quiet now, asleep. He longed for that quiet. He longed for a moment where he didn't have to be anything but himself. But who was that anymore? Sometimes he wasn't sure he remembered. When the wrought iron gates of Graceland finally swung open, revealing the familiar white columns of his mansion, a wave of relief washed over him. Home sanctuary, yet even here the echoes of fame lingered. The house was meticulously maintained, a testament to his success, but also a monument to his isolation. Friends and family were often around, but their presence too sometimes felt like a continuation of the public gaze. Everyone expected something from Elvis. He walked through the front door, the click of the lock echoing in the grand foyer. The house was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of the night staff. He didn't go straight to bed. His mind was still buzzing, 1,000,000 miles an hour. He wandered through the living room, a vast space filled with ornate furniture, plush carpets, and a grand piano tucked into a corner. It was a beautiful instrument, polished to a high sheen, its dark wood reflecting the soft glow of a nearby lamp. He rarely touched it. He could play a little enough to pick out chords, to accompany himself on a song, but his main instrument was his voice, his guitar. Piano was usually just a decorative piece, a symbol of the opulence he now enjoyed. He stopped in front of it, running a hand over the cool, smooth surface of the fallboard, the cover over the keys. The keys themselves looked like a perfect row of white teeth, waiting, he remembered faintly. His mother Gladys humming a tune as he picked out a simple melody on an old beat-up upright piano back in Tupelo's simpler times. Times when music was just pure joy, not a commodity, not a performance. A sigh escaped him. He was too tired for such reflections. But something in the silent presence of the piano, standing there so patiently, so ready, tugged at something deep inside him, a forgotten chord, a quiet promise. He turned away, heading towards the stairs, but the image of the piano stayed with him, a quiet sentinel in the heart of his gilded cage. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. The morning light, soft and gentle, filtered through the heavy drapes in Elvis's bedroom. He slept late, as was his custom after a late-night performance. The dreams that haunted him were often a jumble of flashing lights, screaming crowds, and the endless pressure of being Elvis. But this morning, a different kind of quiet had settled over him, a yearning for something less chaotic, something more real. He eventually rose, moving slowly, the residual exhaustion from the previous night clinging to him like a second skin. Graceland was beginning to stir around him. He could hear the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the low voices of staff members going about their morning routines. But in his wing of the house, a sense of stillness prevailed. He showered, dressed in comfortable slacks and a loose shirt. No gold lane today, no rhinestone-studded jumpsuits, just simple clothes for a simple man, if only for a few hours. He went downstairs past the grand staircase into the spacious living area. It was always impressive even to him. The chandeliers glittered, the velvet upholstery invited comfort, and the polished wood gleamed. It was a home, yes, but also a museum. A testament to a life lived in the public eye. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and wandered. He looked at the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Pictures of his parents, of Priscilla, of a baby Lisa. Marie, happy moments, frozen in time. But even these memories felt distant sometimes, overshadowed by the relentless demands of his career. His gaze drifted again to the music room, specifically to the grand piano that sat in its designated corner. It seemed to call to him a silent invitation. Yesterday, he had been too tired. Today, a flicker of curiosity, a faint pull, urged him closer. He remembered a time long ago when music was simply fun. Back in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he'd been born, music had been everywhere, in church, on the radio, in the simple strumming of a guitar, never claimed to be. But he'd loved the sound of it, the way the notes resonated, the way a melody could lift your spirit or stir your soul. He approached the piano, running his fingers along the glossy surface of its lid. It was cool and smooth. He noticed a thin film of dust on the fallboard, proof of how rarely it was played. It seemed almost out of place amidst the perfection of Graceland, a forgotten relic of a simpler, less complicated joy. A sudden, clear memory surfaced. His mother, Gladys, sitting beside him on a rickety piano stool in their small Tupelo home. He must have been just a boy. The piano had been old, probably borrowed its keys, yellowed, and some stuck. But he remembered the thrill of pressing down on a key, the distinct ping that erupted. Gladys had smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's it, son," she'd said, her voice soft and encouraging. "Just follow your heart, and the music will follow." He missed her so much. The fame, the money, the adulation, none of it could fill the void. Her absence had left. She had been his anchor, his greatest supporter. She had seen him truly, seen him beyond the flash and the fanfare. He pulled out the plush velvet piano stool, the kind that looked more like a prop than a functional seat. It was heavy, solid. He sat down, the stool sinking slightly under his weight. He looked at the keys, a perfect row of ivory and ebony. They felt foreign yet familiar, like meeting an old friend after many years. The room was still the gentle hum of the house. The only sound he could easily be interrupted. Someone could walk in, ask him a question, or simply stare. Expecting Elvis. The thought made his shoulders tense. But for now, he was alone. Something that spoke to the part of him that rarely got to breathe. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the silence. The world outside Graceland could roar and clamor. Here, in this quiet corner, the only sound that mattered would be the one he made himself just for himself. Took a deep breath, his heart beating a little faster, not from excitement, but from a sense of anticipation. This was unfamiliar territory, yet strangely comforting. He was ready to let the piano speak, and perhaps let his own true self whisper a few words in return. He lifted his hands, his fingers hovering over the keys like a bird contemplating flight. They were strong hands used to gripping a microphone, strumming a guitar, signing autograph. They felt clumsy, uncertain, now poised above the polished ivory. The piano seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He pressed down on a single white key, middle C. The note resonated clear and true, filling the quiet room with a pure, sustained sound. It wasn't loud, not like the blare of a trumpet or the thundering beat of drums. It was soft, almost delicate, a gentle hum that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He felt it in his chest, a comforting tremor. He pressed another key, then another, slowly, tentatively. A simple three-note melody emerged, almost a sigh. It was a melody he didn't recognize, something his fingers were finding on their own. He wasn't trying to play a song. He was simply letting the sounds unfold. The dust, he noticed, was barely there. He'd imagined it thicker, a symbol of neglect. But it was just a light film, easily wiped away with the sleeve of his shirt. The keys themselves felt smooth and cool beneath his fingertips. His mind drifted back, not to the last show, but much further, to a small clapboard house in Tupelo, to a little boy with big dreams and an even bigger voice. Money had been scarce then, luxuries non-existent. But music, he remembered, had been abundant. He'd found an old upright piano in the community center, or maybe it was at a friend's house, the details hazy with time. It had been battered, scarred, but it had worked, and he, a curious, eager child, had spent hours sitting there, picking out melodies by ear. He didn't have lessons, didn't know scales or chords in any formal way. He just listened, absorbed, and then tried to recreate the sounds he heard, or simply the sounds he felt in his own heart. He remembered the pure, unadulterated joy of it. The thrill of making a sound, any sound, that was his own, no expectation. He could make the piano sing a gospel hymn or a mournful blues tune, or even a silly little jingle he'd made up himself. It was pure freedom. Now, as his fingers fumbled over the keys, a warmth spread through him. It wasn't the heat of stage lights, but a different kind of warmth, soft and comforting. He started to play a simple chord, then another. The sounds blended, harmonious and soothing. He found himself playing a slow, mournful blues progression. It wasn't polished, not like the slick studio recordings he made. It was raw, heartfelt, almost hesitant. Each note seemed to carry a burden, a quiet ache that he rarely let surface in public. The loneliness of fame, the weight of expectation, the constant need to please everyone. It all seeped into the melody. His eyes were closed now, his head slightly bowed. He wasn't thinking about technique or whether anyone was listening. He was just feeling the vibrations of the keys under his fingers, feeling the music flow through him, a gentle current washing away the grime of the outside world. This wasn't Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. This was simply Elvis, the boy from Tupelo, sitting at a piano, finding solace in the simplest of sounds. The notes were like whispers in the quiet room, a conversation between his soul and the aged wood of the instrument. It was a language he rarely spoke anymore, a private tongue he was just beginning to rediscover, and with each hesitant chord, a tiny piece of the immense pressure he carried seemed to lift, leaving him feeling a little lighter, a little more himself. The dusty keys were not just keys. They were portals to a forgotten peace. The blues melody continued, a slow, mournful river of sound that flowed from his fingertips. But then, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. The sorrow began to recede, replaced by a glimmer of something else, hope, or perhaps simply acceptance. Chords became richer, fuller, no longer just a lament, but a quiet reflection. He wasn't playing any specific song now. It was an improvisation, a spontaneous creation, born from the depths of his being. His fingers, initially clumsy, began to move with more confidence, finding patterns, creating harmonies. He wasn't a master pianist, but he understood music intuitively. He understood rhythm, melody, and how to make an instrument sing. He hummed along softly, a deep resonant rumble in his chest. Then, almost without thinking, words started to form, not sung loudly but whispered almost to himself. It wasn't a song from his repertoire, but a simple, heartfelt plea, a longing for peace. "Oh, sweet silence, be my guide," he murmured, his voice husky. "Wash away the tide of fame and fortune, worry and strife. Just let me breathe this quiet life." His voice, stripped of all amplification, was raw and pure. It was the voice that had moved millions, but now it was for an audience of one, himself. There were no flashing lights, no screaming fans, no microphones. Just the gentle reverberation of the piano and his own unadorned voice. He closed his eyes again, letting the sounds wash over him. Each note was a drop of calm, slowly filling him, erasing the sharp edges of stress and anxiety. He felt the tension in his shoulders, eased the knot in his stomach loosen. Constant buzz in his mind, the endless to-do lists and worries about tours and movie contracts began to fade. He shifted gears, a gospel rhythm emerging from the blues. It was innate in him, the gospel music he'd grown up with, the hymns that had filled his childhood church. The notes were full of faith, of hope, of an unwavering belief in something greater than himself. This was the music that had always grounded him long before the rock and roll explosion. He played Amazing Grace, not the polished version he might sing in concert, but a slow, tender rendition, full of reverence. His voice rose a little, still soft, but carrying the weight of years, of struggles of a deep, abiding faith. He wasn't performing for God. He was communing with him. The room around him seemed to transform in Graceland. It became a sanctuary, a quiet chapel, where only true feelings were allowed. The afternoon sun, filtering through the windows, cast long golden shadows across the floor, making the scene feel even more sacred. He played for what felt like hours, though it might have only been minutes. Time lost its meaning. He explored different keys, different rhythms, different emotions, played a fast, joyful boogie-woogie for a moment, letting loose some of the pent-up energy, then slowed down to a melancholic ballad. Each piece was a snippet of his soul, revealed only to the piano. He found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. It was a smile he rarely showed in public, a smile of pure contentment. This was it. This was the feeling he'd been searching for, the elusive peace that the world of fame often denied him. Here at the piano, he was simply a man making music, finding solace in the very thing that had brought him so much fame, but in a way that was entirely his own. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed was not empty, but rich and resonant. It vibrated with the echoes of the melodies he had played, the emotions he had released. He felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The world outside still waited, but for now, in this quiet room, he had found a different kind of song, one that played only for himself, a private symphony of his soul. He lingered at the piano even after the last note faded. The air in the music room still hummed with the quiet energy of the melodies he just played. He felt a profound sense of release, as if he just had a long, honest conversation with a trusted friend. Piano had listened without judgment, absorbing every raw emotion, every unvoiced thought. His fingers, still tingling from the vibrations of the keys, brushed against the polished wood. He felt an urge to continue to explore further. This wasn't about rehearsing for a show or perfecting a new hit. This was about discovery. He began to experiment. He tried a blues riff, letting his left hand lay down a steady walking bass line, while his right hand danced over the higher keys, weaving improvisational melodies. Thought about the bluesmen he admired, the raw emotion they poured into their music. Here, in this private space, he could tap into that same wellspring of feeling. Closed his eyes, his head swaying slightly to the rhythm, lost in the ebb and flow of the notes. Then he shifted to a softer, more reflective tune, played a slow, tender melody, something that sounded like a lullaby or a prayer. His thoughts drifted to his daughter, Lisa Marie. He loved her fiercely, but the demands of his career often kept him away. He longed for simpler times, for ordinary moments of fatherhood. The music expressed that longing, a gentle ache in his heart. He even tried a bit of classical music, something he'd heard once and admired, though he had no formal training. His attempts were rudimentary, but he enjoyed the challenge, the pure concentration it required. It pulled him completely out of his head, away from the endless cycle of celebrity. For a few moments, he wasn't Elvis Presley, the superstar. He was just a man trying to coax a beautiful sound from an instrument. Sometimes he'd hum along, his voice a low rumble. Other times, he'd sing full words, simple phrases that came to him in the moment. "Just me and you, old friend," he'd whisper to the piano, a quiet confession. "You know my secrets." And the piano did know. It knew the loneliness that sometimes crept in, even surrounded by so many people. It knew the pressure to constantly innovate, to always be bigger, better, more. It knew the doubts that sometimes gnawed at him, the fear of losing his touch, of disappointing the millions who looked up to him. And it knew the deep, unwavering love he held for his family, for his music, for the spiritual path he tried to walk. He discovered that the piano wasn't just a way to make music, it was a way to process his life. Each chord, each melody was a release. He could pour out his frustrations, his anxieties, his hopes, and his joys into the keys, and they would absorb it all, transforming it into something beautiful and resonant. He started to notice nuances in the sound, the way a certain key resonated differently, the subtle changes in tone when he pressed the pedal. He was becoming more attuned to the instrument, developing a unique relationship with it. It wasn't about mastering technique. It was about understanding the language of the piano and allowing it to speak his truth. He found himself spending more and more time in the music room, usually when the house was quietest, late at night when the staff had retired, or early in the morning before the day's demands began. These sessions became his refuge, his secret garden of sound. He even started to compose, not formal songs with verses and choruses, but short, emotional pieces. A series of melancholic chords, followed by a sudden, bright, hopeful progression, a fast, joyful burst of notes that faded into a gentle, lingering hum. These were his private symphonies, unheard by anyone else, existing only for him in that moment. When he finally stepped away from the piano, his mind was clear, his spirit refreshed. The weight that had settled on him earlier in the day had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He felt more whole, more grounded. The music he played for himself was a different kind of song, one that nurtured his soul and reminded him of who he truly was, beyond the flashing lights and roaring crowds. It was a song of authenticity, sung from the deepest part of his heart. Elvis continued to play, lost in the quiet world he'd created at the piano. The afternoon sun, which had originally bathed the room in golden light, was now beginning to dip lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floorboards. The changing light created an atmosphere of intimacy, making the room feel even more secluded, more sacred. He was improvising again, a seamless blend of gospel and blues, his voice a low melodic hum accompanying his fingers. His head was bowed, his eyes closed, his expression one of profound peace. He was so deeply immersed in the music that he was oblivious to anything else around him. Suddenly, a soft creak of a floorboard broke the spell, though he didn't register it consciously. The sound was almost imperceptible just outside the music room's open doorway. Aunt Delta Biggs, his father, Vernon's sister, had been quietly going about her tasks in the hallway, arranging flowers in a vase. When the soft, unfamiliar sounds had drifted to her ears, she paused, tilting her head. It wasn't the usual rock and roll music that often blared from radios or record players. In the house, this was different, softer, more heartfelt. Curiosity, gentle and respectful, drew her to the doorway. She peered in her movements, slow and quiet, careful not to disturb whatever was happening. And then she saw him, Elvis, but not Elvis. This was the man she knew, the one she'd watched grow up, the one who still occasionally called her Aunt Delta, with a boyish grin. He was hunched over the grand piano, his famous profile silhouetted against the fading light. His usually restless body was still completely focused on the keys. His fingers moved with a practiced ease, coaxing beautiful melancholic notes from the instrument. His lips were parted slightly as he hummed a deep, soulful sound that resonated with the piano's melody. His eyes, she noticed, were closed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. What struck Aunt Delta most was his expression. It wasn't the mad, confident look he wore for the cameras or the crowds. This was an expression of vulnerability, of deep contentment. He looked free, unburdened, as if the weight of the world which he carried so often had momentarily lifted from his shoulders. She watched, mesmerized, for several long minutes. He played a slow, spiritual tune, one that might have been heard in a small country church. His voice, unamplified, was surprisingly tender, filled with a raw emotion. She hadn't heard from him in years. Not like this. It was pure, unadulterated devotion expressed through music. Aunt Delta felt a lump form in her throat. She understood in that moment the immense pressure he lived under, the constant demands, the relentless spotlight. And she understood, too, the profound solace he was finding in this quiet, private act of creation. This wasn't for anyone else. This was just for Elvis. She knew instinctively that this was sacred. This was a side of him he rarely, if ever, showed to the outside world. It was a secret he guarded, perhaps even from himself. To interrupt him, to make her presence known, would be to break that fragile spell, to shatter the peace he had so clearly found. With the utmost care, she began to back away from the doorway, one slow step, then another. Her heart felt full, a mix of affection and a quiet sadness for the sacrifices he had made for his fame. She knew without a shadow of a doubt that what she had just witnessed was a precious moment. It was a privilege to have seen it. She retreated down the hallway, the faint echoes of his private symphony following her. She wouldn't tell a soul this wasn't gossip. This was a private prayer, a silent testament to the man behind the legend. She would carry the image of him, peaceful and lost. In his music, in her heart, a quiet understanding of the true king. He was, even when no one was watching. The secret was safe with her. Elvis played on for a while longer. Completely unaware of the quiet, fleeting presence at the doorway, he transitioned from the spiritual to a bluesy tune, then back to an improvised melody that felt both melancholic and hopeful. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, the room felt still and peaceful, a sense of calm settling over him. He stretched, feeling a lightness in his chest that hadn't been there in days. He had found a wellspring of peace, a quiet corner of his soul where the demands of fame simply couldn't reach. He left the music room, feeling refreshed, and went about his evening, the lingering echoes of his private music providing a quiet soundtrack to his thoughts. He didn't know that his secret was now shared, albeit with someone who respected it deeply. Meanwhile, Aunt Delta continued her day, but the image of Elvis at the piano remained vivid in her mind. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a revelation. She saw him not as the king of rock and roll, but as a sensitive, yearning soul, seeking solace in the purest form of music. Her affection for him already deep, intentionate. "You wouldn't believe what I saw Elvis doing today," but the words died on her tongue. No, this was too personal, too sacred. It felt like overhearing a prayer or witnessing a private moment of grief or joy. It was not hers to share. She understood instinctively that this was his way of finding himself again, away from the world's gaze. It was his anchor. And so Aunt Delta became the keeper of a quiet, beautiful secret. When she saw Elvis at dinner later, she simply offered him a warm smile. A little more knowing than usual, but without a hint of what she had witnessed. He smiled back, a genuine, relaxed smile, looking more at peace than she'd seen him in a long time. For Elvis, the piano sessions quickly became a cherished ritual. The next day, as the afternoon wore on, he found himself drawn back to the music room. He told his staff he needed some quiet time, a common enough request that wouldn't raise suspicion. He slipped into the room, closing the heavy doors behind him, not quite locking them, but signaling his desire for solitude. He sat down at the piano and the familiar sense of calm washed over him. He found himself picking up where he left off, exploring new melodies, revisiting old ones. He discovered that the music was not just a way to escape, it was a way to ground himself. It was a conversation with his innermost thoughts, a safe space where he could process the overwhelming realities of his life. He started guarding these moments fiercely. If someone knocked, he'd say he was resting or reading. He began to look forward to these times more than anything else. They were his moments of pure, unadulterated authenticity. He could wear old clothes, mess up his hair, sing off-key, or simply sit in silence, letting the keys speak for him. No one judged. No one expected anything. The piano became his confessional, his therapist, his most loyal friend. He found himself humming the melodies, even when he wasn't at the piano, a quiet soundtrack to his days. Peace he found there began to seep into other parts of his life. He found himself a little less tense, a little more patient, a little more genuinely present in his interactions with others. He realized this wasn't just a hobby, it was essential for his well-being. The public Elvis was a character, a dazzling performance. But the private Elvis, the one who sat at the piano and poured out his soul, that was the true man. And that man needed these moments, these quiet symphonies, to survive the gilded cage of his fame. He knew now that he had found something truly precious, a secret solace that would sustain him. As Elvis continued his private piano sessions, the music became more than just an escape. It became a conduit to his past, a sounding board for his deepest reflections. The melodies he played often led his mind back to his roots, to the humble beginnings that felt a million miles away from the grandeur of Graceland. He'd often find himself playing an old spiritual, the kind he'd sung in church as a boy in Tupelo. Songs like Peace in the Valley or Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. His fingers, though not formally trained in gospel piano, found their way intuitively, guided by years of listening and feeling the music deep in his soul. As he played, he could almost hear his mother Gladys singing alongside him, her voice clear and pure, filling the small wooden church. He remembered her unwavering faith, her quiet strength. He remembered the comfort those songs brought to their struggling family, the way they lifted spirits and offered hope when there was little else. Playing them, now alone in his opulent music room, brought a lump to his throat. He missed her fiercely every single day. The fame and fortune he had achieved, all the things he had wanted to give her, felt hollow without her beside him. The music allowed him to grieve, to process the profound loss. He would play a slow, poignant chord progression, and memories would flood back. Her gentle touch, her proud smile, her unconditional love. He would whisper her name sometimes, letting the sound merge with the notes, a private homage to the woman who had believed in him before anyone else. He reflected on his journey, the poverty, the dreams, the sudden explosive fame. He thought about the sacrifices, the loss of anonymity, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being public property. The piano didn't judge his success or his struggles. It simply resonated with whatever he poured into it. Sometimes, he'd play a raw bluesy tune, thinking about the tough times, the loneliness he sometimes felt, despite being surrounded by so many. Other times, he'd strike a joyful rock and roll chord, remembering the exhilaration of those early performances, the sheer thrill of connecting with an audience and setting them on fire. But even those memories, through the lens of his private piano, felt different, stripped of the pressure, imbued with a simple, pure love for the music itself. He recognized that the music, played just for himself, was a way of connecting with the core of who he was, beyond the persona. It reminded him that he was still the same boy from Tupelo, still full of faith, still loved his family, and still found profound solace in a simple melody. The piano was a bridge between the Elvis Presley the world knew and the humble, spiritual, thoughtful man he was beneath it all. He started to feel a sense of reconciliation. He couldn't change the path his life had taken, couldn't erase the fame, but he could find moments of peace within it. Piano was his anchor, pulling him back to who he truly was, reminding him of the values that mattered most. One afternoon, as a particularly moving gospel tune flowed from his fingers, a single tear tracked down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of release, of understanding. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for these quiet moments, for this unexpected sanctuary. The music was cleansing him, washing away the layers of public expectation and allowing his true self to breathe. He was healing, note by note, chord by chord. Piano sessions at Graceland weren't just a fleeting phase for Elvis. They became an indispensable part of his life, a vital ritual he guarded with increasing determination. He structured his days whenever possible to include this precious private time. Became the calm in the eye of his personal storm, the quiet counterpoint to the thunderous roar of his public existence. He discovered that these moments weren't just about playing music. They were about reclaiming himself, away from the demands of his manager, the expectations of his band, the relentless flash of cameras, and the adoring screams of fans. He could simply be king of rock and roll persona, so carefully crafted and maintained, could be shed like a heavy coat, revealing the authentic man underneath. The music room, specifically the grand piano within it, became his true sanctuary. It wasn't just a space in his lavish home. It was a sacred haven. He would often ask for no interruptions, sometimes even leaving a small handwritten note on the door. "Quiet, please. Creative time." His staff, ever respectful and loyal, understood without needing further explanation. They sensed the importance of these moments for him. He'd walk into the room sometimes with a heavy heart from a difficult meeting or a tiring obligation, and sit at the piano. Cool touch of the keys, the familiar weight of the stool, the quiet presence of the instrument itself. It all brought an immediate sense of calm. He'd begin to play, and almost instantly the tension would begin to drain from his body. Played everything: old hymns, blues, progressions, snippets of rock and roll, reimagined in a slower, more soulful way, and endless improvisations that were purely his own creation. Sometimes he sang along softly, other times he just let the notes speak for themselves. The music was a living, breathing diary of his soul. He felt more grounded. The fame often made him feel disconnected, floating above the world, an untouchable icon. But at the piano, he was just a man, could feel his feet on the ground, literally and figuratively. The physical act of pressing the keys, feeling the vibrations, hearing the pure, unamplified sound. It was all profoundly centering. He realized that this wasn't merely a hobby or a way to pass the time. It was a crucial part of his self-care, a necessity for his mental and emotional well-being. It was where he could process his anxieties, find his peace, and reconnect with his core values. Without these moments, he knew the relentless pressure of his career would be unbearable. Quiet confidence that Aunt Delta had noticed in him began to solidify. He felt stronger, more resilient. He still gave his all to his performances, still smiled for the cameras, still embraced his fans. Now, he carried a secret wellspring of peace within him, a knowledge that he had a place to return to, a sacred space where he could recharge his spirit. He understood that true contentment didn't come from external validation, from album sales or screaming crowds. It came from within, from finding moments of genuine peace and authenticity. And for Elvis Presley, that peace was found in the quiet corners of Graceland, at the keys of his grand piano, playing music just for himself. It was his most precious secret and his most profound source of strength. He was not just surviving, he was thriving, rooted deeply in the unseen melodies of his private sanctuary. The afternoon sun, now a familiar companion to his ritual, streamed through the windows of the music room, painting warm stripes across the grand piano. Elvis sat there, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the keys. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since he first sat down at this piano, seeking solace from the demands of his world. Now it was second nature, as essential as breathing. He began to play, and the music that flowed from his fingertips was a quiet symphony of his life. It started with a slow gospel-infused melody, reminiscent of his childhood in Tupelo, a tribute to his mother, and the faith that still guided him. The notes were full of reverence and quiet strength. Then the rhythm shifted, becoming more bluesy, a lament for the unspoken pressures of fame, the moments of loneliness and longing that even a king could feel. His fingers danced over the keys, weaving intricate patterns, each note a confession, a release. But the blues didn't linger. A new energy emerged, a touch of rock and roll, but softer, more contemplative than the stadium anthems. It was the rhythm of his passion, the pure, unadulterated joy he found in music stripped of all performance. He hummed along a contented sound, his voice rich and deep, just for his own ears. He played a medley of his inner self, not a medley of his hits. It was a dialogue between his past, his present, and the quiet hopes for his future. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply expressing. The music was honest, raw, and profoundly beautiful in its simplicity. He finished with a series of long, lingering chords, each one fading slowly into the silence, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. He sat there for a moment, his hands still on the keys, feeling the last vibrations hum through the wood. The quiet was not empty. It was full, saturated with the echoes of his private symphony. He finally lifted his hands, a soft sigh escaping him. He felt completely refreshed, centered and whole. The weight of the world, which had often felt crushing, was now manageable. He understood that these quiet moments, this secret connection with the piano, were his anchors. They were what kept him grounded, what allowed him to maintain his spirit amidst the chaos of his extraordinary life. He rose from the piano stool, stretching slowly. He wasn't tired anymore. He felt invigorated. He looked at the piano, a silent, dark presence in the room, and a gentle smile touched his lips. It was more than an instrument. It was a confidant, a sanctuary, a true friend. He walked out of the music room, closing the door softly behind him. The house was still quiet, but the quiet no longer felt isolating. It felt like a warm embrace. He carried the melody of his private symphony within him, a secret strength that permeated his very being. As he stepped back into the public areas of Graceland, ready to face the demands of his day, the phone calls, the meetings, the preparations for the next tour, he did so with a quiet confidence that was subtly different. The world outside would still see Elvis Presley, the flamboyant superstar. But within him, the true Elvis, the man who found solace at the piano, was at peace. He had found his secret melody, the one he played only for himself, and it was the most beautiful music he had ever made. And because of it, he was truly, finally content.